Dear students, Assalamu alaikum. You know that these days, because of the time constraints, I'm not able to conduct my physical classes as per the regular schedule. There are certain other limits in the scheduling of my classes because of which there is a gap in my teaching. But because your time is very precious, I do not want to put this gap in your learning. The best solution that came to my mind is that I will get this lecture recorded so that you can still improve your learning without any gap and also enjoy this lecture in the comfort of your own homes. Have I to remind you that last topic that I was discussing in the class was about change of narration or direct and indirect. So you can resume your learning by means of this recorded lecture, and here I'm going to start my discussion on the same topic. But before I open my discussion, I would first of all ask you to stop my lecture over here. First of all, get hold of a notebook and a pen, and then resume my lecture from the same point. I am going to talk about the change of narration. Dear students, first of all, I will tell you how to deal with the sentences in the direct narration that involve simple questions. Let me tell you that by simple questions, I mean those questions which start with an auxiliary verb, which is then followed by the subject of the sentence. After the subject of the sentence, we submit the remaining verb, and then if we also want to mention certain other elements of the sentence, we put those elements of the sentence afterwards, and then there is a question mark at the end of this type of sentence. Whenever we deal with a sentence in the direct narration whose reported speech contains a question of this type, I mean the question starting with an auxiliary verb, which I call simple questions, you have to take care of 2-3 important rules. Number one, when we convert the sentence into its corresponding indirect narration, then the reporting speech would also undergo a change, and instead of using the words like XYZ said or informed, we will take care of using some verb that represent a question like asked or inquired. The second important thing is that in this type of sentence, which contains a simple question, your inverted commas would be replaced by the word if or whether. The words if or whether would replace the inverted commas and connect two parts of the sentence, or rightly speaking, two clauses of the sentence in the indirect narration. The third thing that you have to take care of is that unlike the direct questions in which the auxiliary verb always appears before the subject, in the indirect narration of such a sentence, the auxiliary verb should not appear before the subject. Rather, it would be shifted to a position after the subject. I repeat, because this is an important point. If we convert a sentence whose reported speech contains a simple question, I mean the question starting with the auxiliary verb, then its indirect narration will have a structure in which the auxiliary verb, after all the other changes, would be placed not before the subject but to a position after the subject. And the last thing that you have to take care of is that in case of the indirect narration, the sentence will not be closed with a question mark. Rather, it would be closed with a full stop. After revising all these governing rules for this type of sentence, I give you some sentences for further learning on the basis of practice. This is the first sentence. I read it for you. Dawar said to me, comma inverted commas begin, Have you parked your car behind the hostel? Question mark, inverted commas, closed. Now you can clearly understand that in this direct narration, the reporting speech is in the past tense, and then the reported speech contains a simple question. And the simple question starting with the auxiliary verb have belongs to present perfect tense. And you know that because the reporting speech is in the past tense, this present perfect tense of the reported speech would also be changed into past perfect tense, and have would change into had. But the position of had would be after the subject. So if you understand all these things and take care of all these things and you apply your concepts correctly, then you can easily understand the indirect narration of the given sentence, which is this. Dawar asked me if I had parked my car behind the hostel. Or Dawar asked me whether I had parked my car behind the hostel. You will use only one word, if or whether. And you can also notice once again that the auxiliary verb had has appeared after the subject I. You know all the other rules which have governed other changes in this sentence, so I'm not explaining all those rules once again. But here is the second sentence for your further understanding of the direct and indirect in case of simple questions. The second sentence comes here. I read it for you. The policeman said to her, comma, inverted commas begin, did your father leave the office in a hurry? Question mark, inverted commas, closed. You know that in this case, the reported speech contains a question starting with did, which means that this question belongs to the past indefinite tense. And because the reporting speech is also in the past tense, so the past indefinite tense of the reported speech would be changed into past perfect tense. So the word did would morph into the word had. So I quickly share with you the indirect narration of this sentence, which is the policeman asked her if her father had left the office in a hurry. Full stop. This is a question, so the word if has been introduced to combine the two clauses, the subordinate clause with the principal clause. And then the word had, which has been changed from did, has been put after the subject. And the rest of the changes have already been discussed with you. Here is the next sentence for your further understanding of change of narration. I read the sentence for you first in the direct narration, which is the teacher said, comma, inverted commas begin, were you fighting with your class fellows? Question mark, inverted commas closed. In this case, you know that the reported speech is containing a sentence in the past continuous tense, and this is a question starting with were and having a form of the verb with ing. And you know, and I remind you, if you have forgotten, that this past continuous tense of the reported speech will be changed into past perfect continuous tense because the reporting speech is in the past tense. And if you apply all the rules to this sentence, it is quite easy for you to understand this indirect narration of the given sentence, which is the teacher asked if I had been fighting with my class fellows. Full stop. The teacher asked if I had been fighting with my class fellows. And now the next sentence. I read it for you first. I said to him, comma, inverted commas begin, has she been waiting for you since morning? Question mark and the inverted commas closed. You can easily identify that the sentence in the reported speech belongs to the present perfect continuous tense. And because it is a question, and it belongs to the present perfect continuous tense, it would be changed into corresponding past perfect continuous tense because the reporting speech is also in the past tense. If you apply all the rules to this sentence, you can quickly understand its indirect narration, which is I asked him if she had been waiting for him since morning. And now the next sentence. I read it for you. She said to him, do you want to buy this suit or not? Question mark, inverted commas closed. Ladies and gentlemen, I will ask you to stop over here for a moment. Look at this sentence once again, read it twice, and then understand that there is a different variety of question. And what is different in this case is that there is a question about an option A or option B. Want to buy this suit or not? Yes or not? America or the United Kingdom? Karachi or Lahore? So whenever you have a question of this type, there are a few additional things that you have to keep in your mind. And one of those additional things is that in this case, while converting such a sentence into its corresponding indirect narration, we will preferably choose the word whether instead of if to combine the two clauses. And the second thing is that in this particular case, when the question is about yes or not, there are two possible indirect narrations, which are these. I read the first one for you. She asked him whether he wanted to buy that suit or not. This is a very simple indirect narration of the given sentence, but some advanced level writers also use the second version, which is considered a smarter one. I read it for you. She asked him whether or not he wanted to buy that suit. So instead of saying whether he wanted to buy that suit or not, which is very simple form, you can also give this sentence a twist and instead say whether or not he wanted to buy that suit. But this style will be applicable to only this type of sentence in which there is something like or not. I hope you have understood all these changes, and now I share with you the next sentence, which is they said to us, comma inverted commas begin, does your father work in a bank? Question mark and the inverted commas closed. Now, there is something new in this sentence, and that something new is the question in the reported speech is actually starting with the word does, which means that the sentence belongs to the present indefinite tense. Please keep one thing in your mind that we have told you that present indefinite tense will be changed into past indefinite tense when the reporting speech is in the past tense. And the word that is alternative to do or does in the past indefinite tense is did. But stop over here for a moment and listen to me carefully to understand that whenever our question starts with do or does, we do not use either of these words or even did in the corresponding indirect narration. What happens is that do or does simply disappear from the indirect narration. When I share the solution with you, you will be in a better position to understand this change. Here is the indirect narration of the given sentence, which is they asked us if our father worked in a bank. Where is do or does or did in this indirect narration? Nowhere. What happens is that in this case, the past form of the verb or the second form of the verb would directly appear after the subject, but there would be no do or does or did. And this happens only in this particular case when we are converting a question starting with do or does into the corresponding indirect narration. And the question becomes an indirect question. Otherwise, whenever we convert a sentence containing do or does, if not a question, when the reporting speech is in the past tense, then do or does would definitely be changed into did, but not in this case. And here is the next sentence for you. I read it for you. We said to him, comma inverted commas begin, did your mother teach you nothing? Question mark and the inverted commas closed. Now in this case, look at the first word in the reported speech, which is did. The question is starting with did, and did means that the tense of this sentence is past indefinite tense. And you already know that whenever there is past indefinite tense in the reported speech and the reporting speech is also in the past tense, then this past indefinite tense of the reported speech would be changed into past perfect tense. So the word had would replace the word did and it will appear in the sentence. So you can easily understand this indirect narration of the given sentence, which is, we asked him if his mother had taught him nothing. In this case, we have to use the word had, but its position is after the subject. Let's move on to the next sentence, which is, she said to me, comma inverted commas begin, this is your car, isn't it? Now, once again, stop over here. We have something new for our understanding. And in this case, there is a new variety of this type of question. What is so special and different in this sentence is that there is a sentence followed by a tag question. So what is a sentence followed by a tag question? I explain it for you. There is always a statement, as we see in this sentence in the reported speech, and that statement is followed by a tag question, something like, isn't it? Don't you? Haven't you? Didn't they? Something like that. So there are two important things that you have to keep in your mind in these sentences, that if the statement that comes first is positive, its tag question would be negative, like we have the case before us in this slide. This is your car, isn't it? This is your car is a positive statement, and the tag question in that case is negative. The second possibility is that when the first statement is negative, then its tag question should be positive. Like, you haven't done your work. Have you? The statement was negative, and the tag question in that case was positive. Now, the next important thing is that whenever you want to convert such a sentence from its direct narration into its corresponding indirect narration, in either case, when the statement is positive followed by a negative tag question, or when the statement is negative and is followed by a positive tag question, its indirect narration would be same. The structure of the indirect narration of either of these two cases would be the same. And the last thing that you have to understand in this case is that you will once again preferably use the word whether to combine the subordinate clause with the principal clause. Don't use if, in this case, use whether rather. So now I share with you the indirect narration of the given sentence, which is, she asked me whether that wasn't my car. Full stop. Whether that wasn't my car. This would be changed into that, and because the sentence has is and isn't, they will be changed into wasn't, because the reporting speech is also in the past tense. One more example of a different type of a sentence followed by a tag question. In this case, we have the statement in the negative and the tag question is positive. I read the sentence for you. I said to you, comma inverted commas begin, you didn't do your work, did you? Question mark and the inverted commas closed. As I told you earlier, that in either case, the indirect narration of such sentences will have a similar structure, so you can easily understand the indirect narration of this type of sentence, which is, I asked you whether you hadn't done your work. Look, the original word was didn't or did, and it would be converted into hadn't. Every time you will be having words like wasn't, haven't, hadn't, isn't in the indirect narration. Having explained this, I share with you one more sentence of the same kind, and that sentence is, he said to her, comma inverted commas begin, you are going to the party, aren't you? Question mark and inverted commas closed. In this case, once again, we have a positive statement followed by a negative tag question. And all the things have already been explained. So I quickly share with you the indirect narration of this sentence, which is, he asked her whether she wasn't going to the party. Ladies and gentlemen, I have put a complete variety of all the questions of type 1, which I call simple questions. And these are specifically the questions every time starting with some auxiliary verb or helping verb. In the next lecture, I will talk about the complex questions when they are to be changed into the indirect narration. Please always keep in your mind that complex questions is the name I grant to those questions which start with some word of interrogation belonging to the WH family, like what, when, where, why, etc. Don't forget this till I start the next lecture. Thank you. Dear students, now that you have learned how to deal with the sentences in the direct narration containing a simple question, this is time to understand how to convert the sentences containing a complex question from its direct narration to the corresponding indirect narration. Please keep in your mind that when we talk about the complex questions, there are questions which, instead of starting with some auxiliary verb or helping verb, start with some word of interrogation like why, where, when, who, whom. Some of the examples are there before your eyes. And now we are going to see if such a sentence is there in the reported speech and we are supposed to convert such a sentence into its corresponding indirect narration, what are the things that we have to take care of? I would explain these things in very simple words for your understanding. Please keep you in your mind once again that in case of such a sentence in the direct narration which contains a complex question, you, while converting that sentence into the corresponding indirect narration, will first of all use the words asked or any other synonym of asked to make a question, to make your readers understand that the coming part of the sentence would actually contain a question. The second thing is that you will not introduce any word if or whether, nothing, at the place of inverted commas, and instead the word of interrogation with which you make a question would retain its place, and this would be the actual word combining the two clauses in the sentence in the indirect narration. The third very important thing that you have to keep in your mind is that whenever you will be dealing with an indirect question of this type, the auxiliary verb should not sit before the subject. I repeat, in the indirect narration, unlike the direct narration, the auxiliary verb should not sit before the subject of the sentence. Rather, it should be shifted to a position after the sentence. Whereas in the direct questions, as you can see, the questions on your screen right now, the auxiliary verb sits before the subject. For example, in the first sentence on this screen, when we say, why are you laughing? The auxiliary verb are would sit before the subject you. Similarly, in the second sentence, the auxiliary verb did has appeared before the subject she. You understand this thing. But please take good care of this change, that in the indirect narration, the auxiliary verb will be shifted to a position after the subject. And the last thing you already know, that we will not introduce a question mark at the end of the sentence, which is in the indirect narration. Having learned all these things, now let's do some practice. And here comes the first sentence for you. She said to me, "Where did you park the car?" She said to me, comma, inverted commas begin, "Where did you park the car?" Question mark and inverted commas closed. Now, if you apply all the things which I have just explained, you can easily understand the indirect narration of this sentence. What we are going to do is that we will introduce some word that tells us that we are going to talk about a question in the first part of the sentence, and then we will retain the place of the word of interrogation. In this case, it is where. The word that is called the auxiliary verb did, it will definitely be converted into had because the reporting speech is also in the past tense, but the position of the had would be after the subject of the indirect question, and we will not put a question mark at the end of the sentence. So if you apply all these things, this will become the possible indirect narration of the given sentence. I read it for you. She asked me where I had parked the car. Full stop. You can see that I have applied all the changes. In the first part of the sentence, we have introduced the word asked because it is being followed by a question. Then we have retained the position of the word of interrogation where. Then we have converted did into had, but we have taken care of shifting the word had to a position after the subject I, and then the remaining changes of the sentence as usual. Let's make some further practice. This is sentence number 2, which says, "They said to her, comma, inverted commas begin, how do you want to settle this matter?" You know that again we will introduce something like asked in the first part of the sentence or the principal clause. The word who would retain its position, and the word do would simply disappear, because I told you earlier in the first part of this lecture that do or does do not appear in case of questions, and the remaining changes are already known to you. That's why we can simply understand this indirect narration, which is they asked her how she wanted to settle that matter. How she wanted to settle that matter. One more example. This time the sentence is, we said to them, comma, inverted commas begin, why are you crying in the hall? Question mark, inverted commas closed. Because you already know what different changes would apply, so without any elaborate explanation, I simply share its indirect narration with you, which is, we asked them why they were crying in the hall. So because the sentence in the reported speech belong to the present continuous tense, we have changed it into the past continuous tense. Why? Because the reporting speech is in the past tense, but the auxiliary verb were has been put after the subject, whereas in the original sentence the auxiliary verb are is before the subject. The word of interrogation why has retained its position, and here you can understand the indirect narration. I once again read it for you. We asked them why they were crying in the hall. One more sentence. I read it for you first of all. The old woman said, who is knocking at the door? Now in this case, This is the indirect narration of the given sentence. The old woman asked, "Who was knocking at the door?" Please notice that who is the word of interrogation, but it is also a subject in the indirect narration, because who is also a pronoun. So that pronoun would become a connecting word between the two clauses. No problem at all. Let's share with you another example, but this time you may get some confusion. You will be able to understand that confusion only after I share the next example with you. Here is the next sentence, which says, "The teacher said, comma inverted commas begin, who is the author of this book?" And while changing this sentence into its indirect narration, if you say the teacher asked, "Who was the author of that book?" it would not be a standard sentence. Let me first of all share with you the standard indirect narration of this sentence, and then you will understand as to why I feel that you may encounter some confusion. This is the indirect narration. First of all, see the indirect narration, and then I will tell you why it is confusing. And then I will, inshallah, clear that confusion. The indirect narration of the given sentence, which is, the teacher said, "Who is the author of this book?" Its indirect narration is, the teacher asked who the author of that book was. Confusing thing is that in the previous sentence, we did not bring a gap between who and was. I can once again ask you to go back to the first sentence that is once again before your screen. The original sentence in the reporting speech was, the old woman said, "Who is knocking at the door?" And its indirect narration was, the old woman asked, "Who was knocking at the door?" There is no gap between who and was. But when we come to the next sentence, which is, the teacher said, "Who is the author of this book?" its indirect narration may confuse us when we say, the teacher asked who the author of that book was. Why not, who was the author of that book? In this case, because the predicate of this sentence is not about the action, rather, it is about the state owned by the subject, who. I have already told you in my regular physical classes that there are two types of predicates, two types of information about the subject in a sentence. Do you still remember? Yes, I hope that you should remember. In one case, the predicate is about a state or condition or form owned by the sentence, and that is this case, which is right now before your eyes. But the second case is when the predicate is about an action owned by the subject, and that was the case we were discussing in the previous sentence. Please keep in your mind that in this case, the auxiliary verb would be shifted to a place as we have shown over here right now, and there can be another further explanation. Whenever this type of sentence is there before you, who alone is not the subject. In this case, who is one part of the subject, and the author of this book or that book is also another part of the subject. So what we do, that first of all we will consolidate the subject, and when the subject would be consolidated according to the rules of change of narration, the auxiliary verb has to be put after the subject, and that explains why in this case was will be shifted to a position after who the author of that book. I hope you can understand. But in the previous sentence, who alone was the subject, and there was no other word in the remaining part of the sentence that could be given the status of a subject. This is a different case. In this case, the subject is not only who, subject is who plus the author of that book. If this point is not clear, I can give you some further examples. Let's move on to the next sentence. Look at these two sentences. One in which the predicate or the question is about the condition or form or state owned by the subject, the first sentence. But in the second sentence, the question is about the action. As I have already explained, that in the first sentence, we are not talking about the action. So the same thing will apply which we have explained in the top sentence. And the indirect narration then would be the policeman asked what my name was. Instead of saying the policeman asked what was my name. But when we come to the second question or second sentence in which the question is about an action, the indirect narration will be slightly different. Let me read the direct narration of the second sentence first and then its indirect narration. The direct sentence is, the policeman said, "What are you doing here?" Now, in this case, the question is about an action. And its indirect narration would be, the policeman asked what I was doing. You can make a simple question, but for your further clarification of concepts, I share one more sentence of this type. Look at this sentence. The customer said, "What is the price of these jeans?" Again, in this case, the question is not about the action, it is about the state. So we will do the same thing which we have explained previously, like this one. The customer asked what the price of those jeans was. And if I share with you the next sentence, the confusion will ultimately be removed. Look at this next sentence in which I have combined both types of questions in the reported speech. Let me read the direct narration for you. The policeman said to me, comma inverted commas begin, "What is your name and what are you doing here?" You notice that the reported speech contains two clauses, both having a form of a question. But the first clause and the first question is about the state, the second one is about the action, and if we apply the relevant concepts, we can easily understand the indirect narration of this sentence, which is, the policeman asked me what my name was, and in this case, what my name is also correct, and what I was doing there. I read it again for you. The policeman asked me what my name was and what I was doing there. We have applied both concepts of the questions as we learned them previously on this sentence. And now, just a few more examples of the complex questions when we want to convert the direct narration to the corresponding indirect narration. This is one more example, but this time it is a simple one. I read the direct narration for you. They said to me, comma inverted commas begin, whom did the police arrest yesterday? Question mark and inverted commas closed. There is no complexity in this question at all, so we can easily understand its indirect narration, which should be, they asked me whom the police had arrested the previous day.
With the help of all these examples, my dear students, I hope that you would have got a clearer concept of different types of questions contained by the reported speech when we want to convert the direct narration into the indirect narration. We stop our discussion over here, and in the next lecture or next part of my lecture, we would talk about another kind of sentences which are called imperative sentences. So we stop our discussion over here. Thank you very much for being with me. Make good note of all whatever I have delivered to you and do a lot of practice for such sentences till the next time when we start discussing imperative sentences.